Hello, General Strike Podcast family. Everyone's having a good Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Another weekly edition of the show, live on Trending Now Network on YouTube, Trending Now Network on Twitch, and Matt Hunter MCR on Twitter. All live. Podcast form on Apple, Spotify, iHeartRadio, I think. All of the other podcast distributors, all that stuff. You know where to support us, you know how to share the show, all that stuff, all below in the description. Obviously, a lot to get into on today's show. We're going to remember MLK, play some clips, obviously read some really great quotes from him, and sort of, again, be engaged in the act of re-radicalizing his legacy. Because for decades now, the neoliberal and conservative wings of our country have obviously de-radicalized him. They have made him from a revolutionary figure into one that people like Matt Gaetz can go and post on Twitter and say, hey, look at me. So you've got to obviously, recontextualize, reframe the picture and the history, because it's been grossly distorted. There's even a really good quote from Lenin on that I should have got and I didn't grab. Anyways, a lot to get to on today's show. Also, I want to go through a anarchist Marxist debate, predominantly through myself, if that makes sense. Obviously, I've been researching for the next episode of History of Socialism, and this episode is covering Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and Mikhail Bakunin, sort of the obviously the height of the 19th century revolutionary and radicalism of the left, right? I want to cover that and obviously the key figures of that. So I've been reading a lot of Mikhail Bakunin's work, and I have a lot of critiques on it that I want to get into. So I thought, why not open the floor and play some clips from other renowned Marxists and anarchists about this issue, so to speak, or to sort of set their stage on what their side represents. Also, I want to play a PragerU video, make fun of it, of course, and a TMBS Illicit History video for Patrice Lumumba, because it was also the 60th anniversary of his assassination by Belgium and U.S. Foreign forces, or foreign operation forces, I should say, in the Congo. So I want to honor his legacy and, again, recontextualize, reframe the history on what happened in the Congo, what happened with Patrice Lumumba, what happened after him. Without further ado, let's get into it. Let me first play this clip and a few clips from MLK to sort of, again, set the stage for what I want to talk about when it comes to him and his legacy.
We must also realize that the problems of racial injustice and economic injustice cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power.
We read one day, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But if a man doesn't have a job or an income, he has neither life nor liberty and the possibility for the pursuit of happiness. He merely exists. Estimated that we spend $322,000 for each enemy we kill in Vietnam, while we spend in the so-called war on poverty in America only about $53 for each person classified as poor. The promises of the Great Society have been shot down on the battlefield of Vietnam, making the poor, white and Negro, bear the heaviest burdens both at the front and at home.
The other thing I want you to understand is this, that it didn't cost the nation one penny to integrate lunch counters. It didn't cost the nation one penny to guarantee the right to vote.
But now we are dealing with issues that cannot be solved without the nation spending billions of dollars and undergoing a radical redistribution of economic power. Yeah.
I mean, I almost don't need to play any other clips, but I will. Because for most people, you don't really hear any of that when you're growing up in America, when you're growing up in our education system. You're not hearing about this extreme and radical call for political and economic redistribution of wealth, of resources, of power, right? We don't hear that in most American circles when it comes to education and comes to mainstream circles, whether it be the media. So like that 2-minute clip in of itself counters so much of what we hear about MLK. You know, we hear so much that he would be a Republican nowadays and shit like that. That he wasn't about socialism. He didn't care about that. When he kind of called himself a democratic socialist, you know, he didn't say that outright. I have the quote right here. Hold on. Where is it? Call it democracy or call it democratic socialism, but there must be a better distribution of wealth within this country for all of God's children. You know, people don't hear that ever. Like, for those that are like, you know, U.S. listeners, you know, I know I have some that listen in the UK and other countries, but for those in the U.S., I mean, have you ever heard that quote in school? Comparing himself to democratic socialism? Or about this quote? The evils of capitalism are as real as the evils of militarism and evils of racism. Like, how often have you heard, you know, the mainstream sort of echo chamber, if you want to call it that, mention that quote, juxtaposing the evils of capitalism with the evils of racism? You don't hear that often. You don't hear it ever, honestly, unless you're listening to left-wing sources. Like, that's the unfortunate truth. Let's play one more, or actually two more. This one on universal basic income.
Now, one of the answers, it seems to me, is a guaranteed annual income, a guaranteed minimum income for all people and for all families of our country. It seems to me that the civil rights movement must now begin to organize for the guaranteed annual income, begin to organize people all over our country and mobilize forces so that we can bring to the attention of our nation. Now, one of the answers,
you know, and it goes along with like Thomas Paine was an advocate for like a universal, what did he call it? There's something else. It was like a universal payment. That's wrong. I know it is. Basically what it was is like once you came of age, everyone got a big giant check from the government, right? It wasn't a annual income like MLK brings or a universal basic income as Andrew Yang obviously popularized in the 2015-16 campaign. But again, the fact that for a lot of people, when we heard about universal basic income, UBIs, it was through Andrew Yang. How do we not hear about it from MLK or Thomas Paine, a founding father, for fuck's sake, right? Like, it's just mind-blowing how something like a UBI was pushed by MLK 60, now pushing what, like 80 years ago, right? Pushing 60, 80 years ago. No, 6 years ago. Yeah, 6 years ago. And it's now becoming like back into like vogue. It's now becoming back part of the like the mainstream political discourse about how to take care of the people, the masses. This was something that was talked about by the most famous civil rights leader ever. And we didn't hear about it until 2015 when Andrew Yang talked about it. It should be criminal what the education system, what the mainstream media sphere has done to MLK's legacy. I like this one a lot. Him on the hypocrisy of the whole lift yourself up by the bootstraps, that whole talking point from the right and from conservatives. He does a really good job here.
At the very same time that America refused to give the Negro any land, through an act of Congress, our government was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor. But not only did they give the land, they built land-grant colleges with government money to teach them how to farm. Not only that, they provided county agents to further their expertise in farming. Not only that, they provided low interest rates in order that they could mechanize their farms. Not only that, today many of these people are receiving millions of dollars in federal subsidies not to farm, and they are the very people telling the black man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. At the very same time that America...
You know, on that note, you know, when it comes to the power dynamic, the material dynamic involved between the rich ruling class, the bourgeois class of America, and on top of it, the white class of America, which has been intrinsically linked through the act of slavery and Jim Crow and Reconstruction, and the material wealth or non-wealth of the proletariat class, the predominantly black and brown people of this country. You know, and the fact that we tell the most impoverished people that have been pushed the most to lift yourself up by the bootstraps when they don't have the boots to lift themselves up is just ridiculous. I see in the chat. Don't worry. You keep watching, though. Maybe you'll learn. It's okay. Let's talk about now the 60-year anniversary of Patrice Lumumba. Oh, it's so good. Should I get Skype open for this guy? No, he doesn't deserve it, right? Anyways, digressing. 6 years ago, Patrice Lumumba was assassinated by Belgium and U.S. forces, predominantly through a CIA-backed coup. And Patrice Lumumba was the first democratically elected president of the Congo. And as a result of him having very minor, and I mean, in regards to like what was happening in the 20th century, very minor economic reforms for nationalization and, you know, land reforms and stuff of that nature, he was obviously quickly targeted by the West. He also did not close off trade to the Soviet Union and China, of course, which automatically made him a threat in the West's eyes and the CIA's eyes in the 20th century, like any other, you know, social democratic state or socialist state that wasn't Sweden. So Patrice Lumumba was an absolute hero for trying to lead the Congo out of colonialism and away from neocolonialism. And his legacy should be remembered. Let's watch this clip, or I should say this documentary from the Michael Brooks Show. Rest in peace to Michael Brooks. Illicit History series. I recommend it to everyone because it is a great series.
I think that the white people should be ashamed of the deplorable situation that has been existing in the Congo, which is not the fault of the Congolese, but which is the result of instigation by European powers who are fighting each other over the mineral wealth of the Congo. And now to make it appear that the Congolese themselves are criminals or brutes because they're reacting to these injustices that they've been victimized by is again ducking the question. Chomsky is the murderer of Lumumba, who was the rightful prime minister of the Congo. Chomsky is the man whose forces fought against the United Nations forces and against the United States. And despite this criminal past of Chomsky, now the United States is backing Chomsky, who has hired South African mercenaries who are hired killers to disrupt the peaceful efforts of the freedom fighters from Stanleyville to make the type of country there that they want.
Patrice Lumumba was the first democratically elected prime minister of the Congo. He came up at the time of African nationalism and Pan-Africanism. Nationalism and the push for liberation really took hold in the 1950s. After World War II, demobilized African veterans of the war who had been drafted and taken to Europe to fight on behalf of empire in wars that they had no role in, came back and started demanding independence.
In 1925, Patrice Lumumba was born in Kasai, a province with a large colonial presence. In his youth, Lumumba was educated at missionary schools. But his first job, he got his political education.
Patrice Lumumba became a clerk in the postal service, and he became a member of the postal trade unions. So that's how he really became involved in mobilizing and speaking, and he started writing for Congolese publications as well. He wrote many articles, many columns, and of course, agitating and promoting independence. He was one of the Congolese who formed the first national party. He became one of the leaders, and he went to Accra, Ghana, where Nkrumah had convened the All Africa People's Party. So when he came back to the Congo, he had an even heightened sense of nationalism, the role of Africa in the world, and the role of Congo in the world and in Africa.
Lumumba's party, the Congolese national movement, grew, but eventually split into factions. The party's moderates thought Lumumba was too strident in his demands for a united and independent Congo.
During some protests against the Belgians, 30 people were killed by the Belgian authorities, and they blamed him and locked him up for quote-unquote inciting violence. But they could not suppress the momentum for independence.
During his time in jail, Lumumba's movement kept the pressure on Belgium.
Early in 1916, the Belgians called a conference in Brussels of all the Congolese parties. But Lumumba's party, which was the only really national party, the others were regional, more ethnic-based, refused to participate. They said, we will not participate unless our leader is released. So they had to release him from prison and flew him to Brussels. And negotiations continued, and the first elections were held in May 1960, and Lumumba's party won the largest margin. So therefore, he formed the first post-colonial government.
Je vous demande de faire.
Ask you to make of today, this 30th June 1960,
une date
an
illustre
illustrious day that would be etched
que
forever
vous
on your
garderez
hearts.
ineffaçablement gravée dans vos cœurs. Une
A
date
date whose
dont
significance
vous
will
enseignerez avec
pass on with
fierté
pride to your children.
la signification à vos enfants. Pour que ceux-ci,
Who in their turn
à leur tour, fassent connaître
pass on to
à
their
leurs
sons
fils
and grandsons.
et à leurs petits-fils l'histoire glorieuse de notre lutte pour la liberté.
He became prime minister, and Joseph Kasavubu became president. And he was much more moderate and much more accommodating to Western interests.
Belgium was not willing to leave, even in 1960. So the Belgians promoted secession of Katanga province. And at that time, Katanga held at least 60% of the known copper resources of the Congo. So they promoted Moise Tshombe, who came from Katanga, from a much larger ethnic group than Lumumba's. And they basically told him, why should Lumumba be your boss? We can make you the leader of Katanga, turn Katanga into a country. So when the secession broke out, obviously Lumumba struggled to keep the country united. He invited the United Nations to try to suppress the secession. But by that time, the Belgians had already landed thousands of troops in Katanga under the guise, during that chaotic period, protecting Europeans, Belgians who were threatened. That was the guise. But in reality, they were actually shoring up the secession and Tshombe's regime. Tshombe also recruited mercenaries from then apartheid-ruled South Africa. So now you have Belgians and you have other white mercenary soldiers fighting to maintain Tshombe's rule. He was widely despised, not only in the Congo, but throughout Africa, as a puppet and a tool of Western and CIA and Belgian interests. In September 1960, Mobutu was encouraged by the Belgians and by the United States CIA to seize power for himself, because there was a dispute between Prime Minister Lumumba and President Kasavubu, who, as I said earlier, was much more accommodating to Western interests. When the UN forces, which had been invited by Lumumba, failed or was unwilling to suppress the secession, Lumumba then asked the Soviet Union to supply him with transport aircraft so that he could transport his own National Army soldiers to try to crush the rebellion. And the United States and the West used that to paint Lumumba as a communist. And during those days of the Cold War, once you're labeled as communist or pro-Soviet in Africa, that was as good as a death sentence.
The Congo became one of the many battlegrounds for Cold War dominance.
Is it possible that there may have been
CIA director,
American agents in the Congo who turned up later in Laos? I mean, are these men on both sides engaged in these battles around the world?
Oh, yes.
Do they meet? Do they?
Well, if they meet too much and they're seen too much, then they use their utility.
CIA's involvement left the Congo destabilized.
Mobutu then took advantage of that environment, and in 1960, he seized power and said he was dismissing both President Kasavubu as well as Prime Minister Lumumba. And then Lumumba was under United Nations, some would say protection, some would say detention, home arrest. But his supporters managed to get him out. And while he was traveling to the eastern part of the Congo, where he had his loyalists who were actually ruling that part of the country, he was pursued and he was captured by the army. Mobutu then handed him to Tshombe in Katanga, and of course, the rest is history.
Lumumba was killed by a firing squad in 1961. Mobutu with little competition for power.
He reinstated Kasavubu as president and made himself commander of the army. But in 1965, he seized outright power and dismissed Kasavubu and made himself both commander of the army and president of the Congo, which he then renamed Zaire in 1971, I believe. Mobutu pretty much ran the show from 1960 to 1997.
Mobutu's regime committed brutal human rights violations, but he remained in the West's good graces due to his hardline anti-communist stance.
I am confident that the close relations between our two countries, based on shared interests and perceptions, will advance the cause of peace and development in Africa.
This, just want to contextualize again, like add all the other parts in motion. This happened concurrently with the sort of socialist communist movement in Ghana that got toppled as well by Western powers. This happened concurrently, obviously, with the U.S.'s civil rights movement and Black Power movement that got repressed drastically by COINTELPRO, sort of measures by the FBI. From 1950 to the 1980s, we saw massive socialist, Pan-African, and communist movements coming out of the Black community all over the world. And it got brutally repressed by the West. And that just doesn't get mentioned enough. That this was a concerted effort by the U.S. hegemonic power in the world. That they want to stamp out any threat to neocolonialism, any threat to U.S. hegemonic control, any threat to the capitalist order. So they stamped it out brutally. And if you look on like a map of like where all the U.S. bases in Africa are, a lot of them are in countries where they topple, where they violently interjected themselves because it's a brutal fucking empire. Moving on to another topic. I want to how to sort of set this one up. Obviously, like I said, I've been doing a lot of research for the next episode of History of Socialism, and it's going to take a while to finish the research because it's the amount of reading I need to do. But obviously, I've been reading away, and I thought, why not come here and sort of bounce off ideas, thoughts with you guys, the listeners and the watchers, because I have a few criticisms of anarchism and a few I have a rant coming. I can feel I have a rant coming about anarchism, and I don't want to rant about anarchists or anarchism because I love anarchism and anarchists. I want to point that out very clearly. I think anarchism, and Marxist and communist and socialist largely have the same goal, which is a stateless class of society. Okay. The means in which we all think about how to get there is different. Right? And at this point in time, I want to make it very clear before I continue that at this point in time, I think that those distinctions between the means of how we get to a stateless and classless society is one that is not the preeminent issue for the left, for anarchism and communism, whatever. It's not a preeminent issue right now. There's so many bigger issues to deal with, and we need to be united right now overall. But since I'm doing a documentary on a time where the communists and the anarchists were split, and did split, I should say, right? Not that they did split. I want to tackle why they did, the issues and the contradictions in theory between the two, and my hangups with it. Because when I started this really radical journey a few years ago, a lot of it was, at least in the beginning, influenced by anarchists. People like David Graeber. People like Noam Chomsky, of course, and I don't want to dismiss them and that journey and what they have done for not the world, of course, but for me personally. But also, like, I've met Richard Wolff, not met him, but I mean I've found him along the way. I found David Harvey along the way. I found other Marxists and revisionist Marxists and the like along the way that countered that argument. And obviously, I've been reading and researching for an entire documentary series on these ideologies. So in the last year or so, it's expanded drastically. And I have issues with, again, the theory. So before I continue with my personal issues, I want to set the ground level, set the foundation. Because I see some people in the chat already, I think, not properly understanding what anarchism is. So I want to play 3 clips, if that's okay with everyone. One from Richard Wolff, which is the real brief description of Marx and Bakunin and their differences, the differences between Marxism and socialism and anarchism. Also, I want to play a video from, what is it? I found it. I thought it was a good video. Then and Now is the name of the channel on YouTube. I don't know the channel that well, but I found the video. I thought it was a decent introduction, just what anarchism is and how it developed and all that. So we're going to play that. Actually, it's 4 videos. I lied. Then Noam Chomsky, brief video on what is anarchism. And then Slavoj Zizek to hate on anarchists, to obviously counterbalance the thought. And then I will give my thoughts on what I've been reading, except from Bakunin, because I've been reading a lot of Bakunin, of course. And I want to give a brief thought on, what's his name? Carl Polanyi, I think is his name. Anyways, on positive and negative freedoms. But anyways, let's play the clips. Here we go.
This is Richard Wolff from Democracy at Work with another response to a question, an Ask Prof. Wolff question from our Patreon community. This question comes from John Ferrer, and it concerns the relationship between the anarchist theoretician and leader Mikhail Bakunin and Karl Marx. And so it opens the whole space for a discussion of the relationship between anarchism and Marxism. And like all the great questions about Marxism and anarchism, it is subject to the different understandings of what those terms mean, to the different interpretations of the philosophies of these 2 major figures from the 19th century. It also is complicated by the fact that Marx and Bakunin worked together to start the International back in the middle of the 19th century, knew each other, worked with each other, and had a kind of theoretical alliance coupled with strong disagreements. So I will not pretend, as I think many others have, that what I'm about to say is the word on the subject. Everybody's interpretation is just that, an interpretation, and mine is no different in that it's an interpretation based on a way of reading what these 2 thinkers had to say. So here's the gist of it. What both men agreed on, and what anarchists and Marxists often agree on to this day, is the critique of capitalism and the sense that society could and should do better than capitalism. That is, both Marxism and anarchism have a deep, long-lasting commitment to socialism as the name of the next system, the system we can build on the basis of capitalism and yet break from capitalism to something that's better for most people. A further area of agreement between Marxists and anarchists, at least most of the time, has been that the state is part of what has to go, that the function of the state is to reproduce the dominant class structure. So in capitalism, the state is the servant of capitalism. Its activities, however it pretends to represent everybody, are mainly geared to reproducing the dominant position of capitalists within a capitalist system. In a way, slave states reproduced slavery, states in the feudal period reproduced feudalism, and states in the capitalist era reproduce capitalism. And that therefore the state is the enemy of both anarchists and Marxists because of its role as a major support for capitalism's reproduction. So then where do they disagree? Their major disagreement is on what Marx sometimes referred to as the role of a state that could represent the working class during an intermediate period from the collapse of capitalism, when the state no longer reproduced it, but before the establishment of socialism, there would need to be a state that could serve the interests of an emerging socialism by blocking the use of the state to reproduce capitalism. In other words, Marx's notion of the state as existing in a transitional period was not an endorsement of the state or a thought that the state should exist within socialism, but should be a tool, a way for the working class to have more power to make the transition from capitalism to socialism. This was anathema to Bakunin, who wanted a direct and pretty much immediate assault on the state to get rid of it, and that was not acceptable, Marx's idea of a temporary transitional role for a state or a state apparatus. And so that has remained part of the opposition that is often found alongside the alliance between anarchists and Marxists. Some of you may have heard the phrase, the withering away of the state. And you may know that that was an objective of the Soviet Bolsheviks who made the revolution there in 1917. The very phrase, withering away of the state, was a statement by their leader, Lenin, to underscore that their objective as Marxists included the removal of a state from the society, because you were getting rid of the class opposition between capitalists and workers, and therefore did not need a state apparatus to enforce that division. So then why the antagonism? Well, there are many reasons, not the least of which, particularly in the United States, has been that the Cold War, since 1945, in other words, a very long time, 75 years, was phrased as a war between the United States and the Soviet Union, between capitalism and socialism, and that therefore the great demon to be avoided was anything to do with socialism, and that usually meant Marxism and so on. Anarchism kind of got pushed to the side. It wasn't a large major movement. There was no society that embraced it as such, no leadership, since partly anarchists don't want that. And so it wasn't the subject of the same kind of persecution and hostility, even though there are plenty of moments in American history where anarchism was the designated demonization of choice at the time. So anarchism is a way for people to be leftist that at least raises the question here in the United States, what exactly is it? What does it mean? People believe they know what socialism means, Russia, China, Cuba, and so on. They believe they understand that. They don't quite get what anarchism is. Plus, there's this peculiar libertarian strain in the United States that makes hostility to the government attractive to Americans, and anarchism then becomes the left-wing version of all of that, and that may explain also why it resurges from time to time. The basic conclusion I draw from this is that Marxists and anarchists, socialists and anarchists, have much more in common than divides them. There ought to be, and there often has been, practical collaborations, alliances, coalitions between them for all kinds of fights against capitalism.
Yes.
Let them debate the pros and cons of a temporary transitional state. Let them debate the pros and cons of the withering away of the state, how that happens, how fast that happens, the forms it takes. That should not prevent the collaboration on the enormous areas of agreement that can be summarized as the critique of capitalism and the advocacy of a transition to socialism.
Ooh, a new economic update with Noam Chomsky? Ooh. I might have to watch that before the show's over. Let me click on it before I completely forget about this shit. Stop it with that awesome music. Okay. Yeah, this came out, what, today? Is today the 18th? Yeah. Yeah, today. Fuck yeah. Okay. We're going to watch that later. Hold on. Heath in the chat saying, ANCAPs don't count. Look, while you're absolutely right that anarcho-capitalists do not count as anarchists because they do not reject capitalism, which is a extreme form of hierarchy and authority. But I think I don't know if what Richard Wolff was really getting to is what I'm thinking of. Because again, I've only been really reading a lot of Bakunin. You know, I've read Emma Goldman before, and Malatesta, and Graeber, and even Chomsky. I've read them all before to a degree. But I'm reading a lot of Bakunin, and even his has a element of individualism that it gives me pause. And I unfortunately did not pull a quote out in the book. I did not mark one down just for this show. Unfortunately, it's just about that issue. But if you read his critique on Marx, what is it? Hold on, what's the title of this fucking chapter? Oh, that's God and State. What is it? I think it's Marx, Freedom, and the State. Is it what it's called? God damn it. I'm so trash. Okay. Marx, Freedom, and the State. God, I was right. You know, I should believe in myself. I just don't. Read that. It's not that long, too, if you want. I actually really recommend it because I'm not going to read it all. Obviously, I'm just going to read a few parts of it after we play all these videos. But if you want to understand the anarchist versus Marxist versus communist divide, that's a really good stepping stone, especially from understanding from the anarchist perspective. I find it really illuminating in both negative and positive ways, right? Let's play this clip just for those that I think maybe don't understand the history of anarchism to a degree, and I think they need a little bit of education on it. Little quick 13-minute video on the history of anarchism. I should probably pull it up, huh? That would probably be beneficial. My dumbass. I swear. Maybe I shouldn't cut myself some slack.
Anarchism is a difficult ideology to define. An anarchism of a sort was present in many movements and ideologies throughout history. From the Taoists in ancient China through to anarchism currently being practiced in Rojava in northern Syria, where communities are attempting to establish autonomous, bottom-up direct democracies where anyone can vote on any issue. Philosophy professor Nathan Jun defines anarchism as a universal condemnation of and opposition to all forms of closed, coercive authority, political, economical, social, etc., coupled with b, universal affirmation and promotion of freedom and equality in all spheres of human existence. For much of history, the term anarchism was, and for many still is, a derogatory term, rather than the name of any movement or ideology. But towards the end of the 18th century, William Godwin began to define anarchism as an ideology for the first time.
Motherfucker looks like Rob.
What is now referred to as classical anarchism was popularized across the course of the 19th century, when most terrorism in the world was also perpetrated by anarchists.
Heroes.
King Umberto I of Italy, for example, was assassinated by an anarchist in 1900. At the height of the French Revolution in 1794, Godwin published An Inquiry Concerning Political Justice, which, while not using the term anarchism, is undoubtedly one of the first modern anarchist texts, and influenced the fathers of socialism and workers' movements like Robert Owen and poets like Percy Shelley. Influenced by John Locke's argument that the mind was a blank slate, Godwin argued that men were born equal and that differences were a product of their environment. Godwin was also a utilitarian. He believed that morality was a system of conduct which is determined by a consideration of the greatest general good. At the same time, he believed that man was perfectible, so that when these three principles were combined, the blank slate, the greatest good, and continual improvement, and as man became more educated and rational, they would become capable of governing themselves. Godwin argued that property accumulation was an evil that should be replaced by a kind of communism where each is entitled to their share of a common stock, and where communities that governed themselves face to face would replace nation states. A technological utopian, Godwin also believed that if everyone took a share of the workload and the innovations of the Industrial Revolution were justly put to use, work hours could be reduced to just half an hour a day. But Godwin was also a gradualist who believed that change would come through careful progression and reform. Next came Max Stirner. Godwin died in 1836, and Max Stirner wrote his magnum opus, The Ego and Its Own, in 1844, where Godwin...
Quickly, for those that like have seen like the famous video, I want to say of like famous... Oh, got my phone. Of Peaky Blinders, right? That famous gif, so to speak, of all the leftist groups, right? And you get the egoist. Max Stirner is kind of the founder of egoism. For those that want to figure that out and find out what that is, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but it's interesting, I guess.
And look to cooperation and community as the essence of anarchism. Stirner argued for a radical individualism. Stirner was heavily influenced by Hegel's dialectics, the idea that progress occurs through the development of a thesis, antithesis, and synthesis that drives ideas and history. Instead of progressing towards the state as the embodiment of the community, though, as Hegel had argued, Stirner thought that the dialectic of history would progress towards a supreme individual freedom, where each man stood on his own moral footing. Stirner's system was supremely philosophically abstract, but his fundamental point was that we are all egoists. For Stirner, we do everything for our own benefit. Even when we are being charitable, for example, we do it because it makes us look good and will benefit us in some way in the end. So morality came from the individual ego. The state then was superfluous because we would be moral anyway to further our own individual interests. Laws and government then are an unjust restraint on the personal freedom of the ego. Stirner famously declared that I am everything to myself and I do everything on my account. For Stirner, there are no rights, there is no transcendent morality. All of these are what he called spooks, invented by the powerful to oppress. I and I alone decide what is right and what is wrong. Stirner believed that instead of the state, people should band together in unions of egoists. Workers, for example, should band together and strike for better pay. The state, he argued, only gets in the way. Because we are roughly equal as humans, unions will balance each other out, leading to a kind of egoistic equilibrium. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon published What is Property in 1840, and it would become one of the most influential anarchist texts of the 19th century. His answer to the question, what is property, was the statement, property is theft. Proudhon argued that property that was the result of labor was legitimate, but property in unused land or property that's profit was a result of rent or interest was illegitimate. He was involved in a dispute with Marx and deserves praise for his foresight that, and I quote, the doctrinaire, authoritarian, dictatorial, governmental, communist system is based on the principle that the individual is essentially subordinate to the collective, that from it alone he has his right in life, that the citizen belongs to the state like a child to the family, that he is in its power and possession, in manu, and that he owes it submission and obedience in all things, thus predicting the horrors of the totalitarian Soviet state in the 20th century. Proudhon wrote that to be governed is to be watched over, inspected, spied on, directed, legislated, regimented, closed in, indoctrinated, preached at, controlled, assessed, evaluated, censored, commanded. Proudhon believed instead in a bottom-up organized federation of communes where the higher levels would be subordinated to the lower levels. This would be the very opposite of a centralized system. Instead of laws, Proudhon proposed contracts between people and groups. This was called mutualism. Another anarchist involved in a dispute with Marx was Mikhail Bakunin, maybe the most famous anarchist. Bakunin believed that justice was synonymous with equality, so that the freedom of each is therefore realizable only in the equality of all. Like Proudhon, Bakunin believed in the commune, which, while federated into larger units, would always retain the right to secede. His ideas of collectivist anarchism argued for equal means of subsistence, support, education, and opportunity for every child, boy or girl until maturity, and equal resources and facilities in adulthood to create his own well-being by his own labor. While not a particularly philosophical thinker, Bakunin is best known as the leader of the anarchists of the First International, which lasted from 1864 to 1876, and for his bitter disputes with Marx over the question of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Bakunin argued that rather than state communism, workers' associations should themselves own the means of production. He argued that authority should be a matter of choice, making the state an illegitimate form of authority. He said, in the matter of boots, I refer to the authority of the bootmaker. Concerning houses, canals, or railroads, I consult that of the architect or engineer. But I allow neither the bootmaker nor the architect to impose his authority upon me. Finally, closing off the end of the 19th century, is Peter Kropotkin. Kropotkin, the eccentric who went from Russian prince and aide to Tsar Alexander II to world-renowned anarchist, was a communist anarchist and a great geographer, whose most famous work, Mutual Aid, was published in 1902. Kropotkin spent much of his life challenging those who thought that Darwin's new theory of evolution as survival of the fittest justified racial and class hierarchy. He argued that rather than competition and the prevailing of the dominant gene, mutual aid and cooperation within species were the defining factors of evolution. He argued that the phenomena of mutual aid and altruism, a kind of natural morality, existed biologically within humans, and so the state was an unnecessary protector of order. Kropotkin has much in common with someone like Rousseau, who argued that humans are inherently good-natured, but live under the corrosive effects of modern society. While traveling the world and writing Mutual Aid, Kropotkin observed beetles helping each other carry and bury prey, too big for just one of them to eat, and ants who shared food and water if they passed another in need, eagles that call on each other for aid and who let the elders and the weak eat before the young and the strongest. He saw packs and prides and schools in cooperation everywhere he looked. And Kropotkin also pointed to organizations like the English Lifeboat Association as an example of a voluntary organization that provides aid without the coercion of the state. As well as mutual aid, Kropotkin wrote The Conquest of Bread, which outlined his views on what an anarcho-communist society would look like. The book influenced anarchists in Catalonia during the Spanish Civil War, and anarchists today still in Rojava. These 5 thinkers provided a rough genesis of anarchist thought that would divide into separate but sometimes overlapping schools. During the 19th century, anarchists would generally either be communists or non-communists. Non-communists, mutualists like Proudhon, usually argued for individual property rights, but equal access to land and the means of production, and the abolishment of rent, profit, and taxation. This was in contrast to anarcho-communists, who would usually argue that the community, rather than the individual, controlled all property, would abolish all market exchange, and would distribute all property by need. In the 1905 entry for anarchism in the Encyclopaedia Britannica, Kropotkin noted that there were 6 main schools of anarchist thought: mutualist, individualist, collectivist, communist, Christian, and literary. Collectivists, for example, argued that a federated system of collective communities would be in charge of the land and the means of production in its area. Kropotkin neglected to include anarcho-syndicalists, which, through unionization, would put all decisions in the hands of the workers and would own the means of production and have an equal say in the decision-making process. Anarchism has a rich and varied history that is impossible to do justice to in a short video. What I have sketched is just the beginning.
I think the video is really good in terms of like giving anyone that didn't know about like the history of anarchism and what the individual schools are a really good foundation. The only critiques I have were the critique. They're weird critiques. One is I forget how he phrased it, but that Bakunin was not a philosophical thinker or writer. And I mean, he's a political philosophist, so I mean, and theorist. So oh, looks like I just bounced out. I'm back. That was odd. That was an odd phrasing. And the other one was the anarchists predicted communism perfectly in the 20th century. I think that's doing that is looking at history in a immaterial manner. That is looking at history through the lens of sort of like a classic liberalist way of looking at history, and I think that's again a immaterialist way of looking at history, a historical way of looking at history as well. But other than that, I thought it was fine. I'm gonna play a couple more clips. Just gotta think they're quality to listen to actual renowned thinkers and what they thought. And then I'll give my thoughts on the research and what I've been reading and the hang-ups I have, the criticisms I have of anarchism thus far. This is Noam Chomsky sort of defining what anarchism is.
Should I go ahead and ask you a question?
Sure, anything.
Okay. We're led to think that anarchism is bomb-throwing mayhem. What is it that attracts you to anarchism?
Anarchism has nothing to do with bomb-throwing mayhem. It's anarchism is a point of view which, first of all,
hold on 1 second. Also, I love when anyone says like anarchism is about chaos. It's like, oh man, that's not what it is.
it covers a lot of things. You know, political rhetoric is not the clearest, it's not a model of clarity. And anarchism has covered quite a lot of ground, but the mainstream of it has just been the basic principle, which I think comes straight out of classical liberalism and the Enlightenment, that any form of authority and domination has a burden of proof to bear. It has to demonstrate that it's legitimate, no matter what it is, whether it's inside a family or the global economy. If it is a form of authority and domination and coercion, it has to show that it's legitimate. If it can demonstrate it's legitimate, it's a heavy burden to bear. If it shows that it's legitimate, okay. If not, it ought to be dismantled. That's anarchism.
Okay, now what is considered legitimate authority?
It's the task of those who have the authority to demonstrate that. So, for example, if I'm taking a walk with my granddaughter, and suppose I'm taking a walk with my granddaughter and she runs out into the street, okay, and I grab her and pull her back. Well, that's authority, and it's my task to demonstrate that it's legitimate. And I think in this case, if anybody challenged me, I could make an argument saying that's legitimate authority. But the burden of proof is always on those who exercise it. That's true if it's men and women, parents and children, owners and people they rent, the state and people who serve it, the IMF and people who follow its orders, wherever it is. So there's no general definition of what legitimate authority is. It's the task of those who exercise authority to demonstrate their legitimacy. They're the ones who have the burden of proof. And if they can't meet that burden by explaining why what they do is legitimate, then they have no right to exercise the authority. And whatever institution, any institution within which they exercise it is illegitimate unless they show otherwise. And the anarchists are just people who believe that and try to do something about it.
So the members of that institution, is it their responsibility to make a judgment call about the authority of the person who is trying to prove their legitimate authority?
Well, I don't mean that every minute of the day everybody has to be saying, look, this is my legitimate authority, but they have to be prepared to meet the challenge.
Sure.
So if it's like suppose it's a formally democratic state, mm-hmm. Well, in principle, that challenge is met by interchange among the population, which recognizes the authority of actions in the public arena through constant interaction, debate, struggle, and so on. In theory, that's what happens if it is a democratic state. To the extent that that doesn't happen, it's not a democratic state and it is illegitimate. When you move to other systems of authority, like say private corporations or fascist states or other forms of totalitarianism, there's no question of legitimacy because they have none.
Right. So, but it's the responsibility of the other people in that institution, whatever that institution might be, to question and to challenge.
No, it's not their responsibility. It's their responsibility to meet the challenge. It's the responsibility of people to make the challenge. So it's the responsibility of, say, women to challenge a framework in which they are supposed to wash the dishes and put the children to sleep and that sort of thing. And it's the responsibility of men in a traditional patriarchic family to answer that challenge. I mean, it would be nice if the challenge could be raised by those in positions of authority, but that's pretty rare. I mean, usually when you're in a position of authority, you kind of internalize the values that say it's right and just. And the reason is because most people are sort of decent human beings, and it's very hard to look in the mirror and say, I'm a bastard. So usually what you do is look in the mirror and say, I'm a nice guy, and I do these things because it's right and just and legitimate. And that's pretty standard, I mean, everybody knows that from their own experience. We don't have to go into it. That's what people are like. And therefore, the responsibility of raising the challenge is typically in the hands of those who recognize that they have a subordinate status. It's very hard to recognize that. I mean, people live, for millennia, without recognizing that they are being subordinated in systems of power. I mean, that's true of women, for example. Or slaves. I mean, most slave societies were accepted by the slaves as legitimate and in fact necessary, and a large part, and the same is true of, for example, people who have jobs today in our society. Almost without exception, they consider it legitimate for them to be in a position where they have to rent themselves in order to survive. It's certainly not obvious, you know. And in fact, if you go back a century ago, it was not only considered not obvious, it was considered outlandish by American working people. And I'm not talking about Marxists or socialists or anybody like that, but say mill hands in Lowell, Massachusetts, who never heard of socialism, who regarded it as a form of slavery and were complaining that they had not fought the Civil War to replace chattel slavery by wage slavery, and that therefore those who work in the mills ought to own them, because that's the Republican rights that we won in the American Revolution, and so on and so forth. So, you know, it's not obvious, but by now I think enough indoctrination and propaganda and so on has taken place, so people do regard that form of subordination to external authority as legitimate. Whether they should is another question, but the fact is they do, just as for most of history women have accepted a subordinate role as correct and proper and so on, and slaves did, and people living in, say, feudal societies. In a feudal society, people had a place, you know, some kind of role. And quite typically, the societies were stable because people regarded those structures as legitimate. The same is true of religious structures, and I mean, throughout human life, there's a whole variety of systems of authority and oppression and domination and so on, which are usually accepted as legitimate by the people subordinated to them. When they don't, you have struggles and revolutions and sometimes changes and sometimes brutality and so on. That's, as far as I understand it, anarchists are just people who take this seriously.
Also, like, if you want to like really simplify it, I always like the David Graeber definition. Like, most people hate the government but love democracy. Anarchism's when you take out the government and you just have democracy. Like, I always like that quote about anarchism as well. Let's play, though, this Zizek clip. And you guys know I'm not the biggest Zizek fan, but I'll be honest, okay? He comes hard at you guys, you anarchists out there. Heath, I see in the chat. And it's pretty funny. I gotta admit, you know, you guys need to have a 24-hour notice on the diss track back, because he came at you guys with some heat. It was, again, I'm not a big fan of Zizek, but God, I was really shocked at how well he talked about it here. It's so funny.
Got caught into this argument once with anarchist groups, friends. They claim we hate states, we want small communities where in a self-transparent way we organize our lives, we run our lives. I told them on 2 counts I'm opposed to you, even on 3 counts. First, but are you aware that, I told them I love things when they really function like that. But are you aware that in order for this to function, you need a good, efficient state to organize the complex background? Like, okay, you organize distribution of electricity. Fuck you, where does electricity come from? It has to be rendered available. Education, healthcare, and so on and so on. So again, the second point, I even doubt, to provoke you a little bit, about this local democracy, this even my good friend Alain Badiou, I think, goes too much into this, that our ultimate goal should be not representative state, but living local democracy where people are immediately present, self-organizing, and so on and so on. Now, I will give you a very brutal argument, but it was made once by Trotsky in a very intelligent way. Namely, to be brutal, would you really like to live in such a shitty local democracy situation? Every afternoon, you have to go to some stupid meeting, how we organize the education of children, how we distribute water, how we do this, that. No, sorry. I want to live in a nicely alienated state. By nicely alienated, I mean it's invisible there, out of your control, but it delivers, it functions. water is here. I don't want to debate every afternoon where water comes from and how. I want water to be here. I want healthcare to be here. I want energy to be here. Again, this is the big problem today. We don't need local democracy. Of course, when it functions, it's nice. But isn't it that all the big challenges that we have today are challenges which need even more than state power? We will have to organize ourselves even at a transnational level. Look, Jean-Pierre Dupuy, the catastrophic theorist, he told me that as a member of some fucking European committee, he was in Fukushima 2 days after the earthquake, tsunami, all that. And he told me that for 1 day, a little bit less, Japanese government was in a total panic because they thought that the pollution will be so strong that they will have to evacuate the entire Tokyo area, 30 million people. If this were to happen, can you imagine where will they put them? The rational solution would have been, of course, to ask Russia to give part of Eastern Siberia. If I'm brutally rational, that would have been the only solution. But how can you do it? No mechanisms to do it or what? You see, we have to confront these problems. And I'm sick and tired of this local. No, we need larger global organisms. This is my big problem with anarcho-syndicalism.
Okay.
Show me one, I just cannot imagine one example of how it worked, taking over the state, replacing the state, whatsoever. Give me one example of anarcho-syndicalism in power. In what sense, I will immediately, in what sense are you questioning power in general? Just opposing it? Or do you think humanity could be reorganized so that we all live together without power? I will put it in another way. The challenges that we are facing today, biogenetics, the only way out, the only way to control the horror of private companies or states doing it, making terrible experiment, is with large, very powerful state or another agency control, limiting it, and so on and so on. Very brutal control. Otherwise, horrors are already happening. I hear all the time from my friends who have friends rumors about how, you know, screw atomic arms. Now we are in that level of biogenetic arms, how to manipulate brains so that you do. So that's my first problem. Second problem, ecology. I cannot imagine how to fight it, how to confront ecological challenges without mega large decisions. Acts. Millions of people will have to be moved and so on and so on. And I just want to know, yes, it functions the way you said, at the local level, communities and so on and so on. But even, isn't it that even for those communities to function, somebody has to provide the basic service, which means water, electricity, education, and so on and so on. For example, in today's confused situation, I think the most dangerous thing is to abolish universal obligatory state education and to say, oh, each community can organize its own education and so on and so on. Society will explode, rich people will become even different race. So you see what I mean.
Hold on.
Democratic socialism.
Oh, hold on. Oh my God. I know it's a Crowder video. God damn, that's the next video we have to watch. No, we have to wait on that, guys. I apologize. Sorry. Let me read some excerpts from Mikhail Bakunin's Marx, Freedom, and the State. I did also read God in the State. And I will say this, that I thought if you ignore all the anti-Semitism in it, which is really hard to do in certain parts, I thought his attack on religion as a construct was pretty convincing, to be honest. And his attack on the state, I thought was, I'll be honest, a little bit rudimentary. maybe because I've heard it a lot before from other people that I thought were a lot better at it. But I didn't think his attack on the state was that amazing, to be honest. Or again, anything new. If you've read Marx's attack on the state or Engels' attack on the state, which I've talked about here on the show, or Lenin's attack on the state, you pretty much heard what Bakunin's thoughts on the state are. But let me read this excerpt about his thoughts on Marx and all that stuff. Quote, I think that liberty must establish itself in the world by the spontaneous organization of labor and of collective ownership by productive associations freely organized and federalized in districts, and by the equally spontaneous federation of districts, but not by the supreme action of the state. There is the point which principally divides the revolutionary socialist or collectivist from the authoritarian communists. We are upholders of the absolute initiative of the state. The goal is the same. Who are the upholders of the absolute initiative of the state? Their goal is the same. Each party desires equally the creation of a new social order founded only on the organization of collective labor, inevitably imposed on each and every one by the very force of things, equal economic conditions for all, and the collective appropriation of the instruments of labor. Only the communists imagined that they would be able to get there by the development and organization of the political power of the working classes, and principally of the proletariat of the towns, by the help of the bourgeois radicalism. Whilst the revolutionary socialists, enemies of all equivocal combinations and alliances, think on the contrary that they cannot reach this goal except by the development and organization not of the political but of the social and consequently anti-political power of the working masses of town and country alike, including all favorably disposed persons of the upper classes who, breaking completely with their past, would be willing to join them and fully accept their program. Hence, two different methods. The communists believe they must organize the workers' force to take possession of the political power of the state. The revolutionary socialists organize with the view of the destruction, or if you prefer a politer word, the liquidation of the state. Now, there's a lot I have issues with this part, to be honest. And I don't want to be petty here, but I actually laughed when I read this. Out loud. My kid was next to me where I was reading it, and you're like, what's funny, Dad? And I'm like, you won't get it. Because, and this gets into another point later on in this book where I believe, I don't know if I marked it. If I didn't, I can just talk about it briefly. It's basically to the effect of the ideal, right? Bakunin talks about it in this book, about the ideal, that we're working for the ideal, that we are the I forget how he said, the utopians of today will be realized as rational men in the future. I think it's how he phrased it. And when he talks about the spontaneous combustion, the spontaneous machinations of political unrest, of workers' co-ops and unions and such, these federations of worker communities and communes, to me, it reads naive. It reads like someone, and it's funny because Bakunin's been intimately involved in revolutions. It reads like someone who hasn't been intimately involved in revolutions. And Bakunin, at this point when he wrote that, had been involved in several. Went to prison for it, lost all his teeth and shit. This guy had went through the ringer by being involved in revolutions around Europe. And he's now at the opinion that, no, we just have to hope that this spontaneously combusts, this system, this capitalist state system that we have, this religious order that we have as well. It's just going to combust, and people, by free association, and as individuals, will decide to collectivize on communes and federalize. To me, it reads as just naive, and I don't know how any other way to put it, because when you compare it to, let's say, the authoritarian communist understanding on how to take power, okay, if right now the material reality of our system is that we have a ruling class, a minority class, a bourgeois class that has a monopoly on power, a monopoly on the laws, a monopoly on military, police, violence, okay? How do you plan to upend that on a global world scale, let alone national, right? Like, how do you plan to deal with that? Just hoping that this spontaneously comes about. And I was really hoping for more in there about how we get there. Maybe when I read Statism and Anarchy, he talks about that more. Because, again, this was a guy that was intimately involved in revolutions in like Austria and Poland and France. Like, this was a guy that had seen revolutions fail. And his plan was, yeah, we don't really need to take state power to dismantle it. We don't need to take who has the power? The state. Who has complete monopoly on force? The state. Okay, then how do we defeat capitalism? Well, we need that same monopoly. I haven't seen him really delve into that issue. And I haven't seen, honestly, anarchists as a whole talk about that. How do we transition from a democratic republic, right, that's based on capitalism? How do we transition from that seemingly overnight to this federalized commune system? There needs to be this transitionary period. There has to be. You know, how can you liquidate the capitalist enterprises, the state enterprises, without that authority, without somewhat that type of power? To me, again, it reads off as naive. And I get the philosophical argument, the political philosophical argument about how you will have to give up certain freedoms to get rid of capitalism, to see the withering away of the state, right? And just like you're going to have to give up some freedoms if you want a completely free society. Karl Polanyi, I believe is how you pronounce that, in 1944, talked about two freedoms, two positive freedoms, or two different types of freedoms. There are, and this is from by way of David Harvey from Brief History of Neoliberalism. Recommend it. There are, he noted, two kinds of freedoms, one good and the other bad. Among the latter, he listed the freedom to exploit one's fellows, or the freedom to make inordinate gains without commensurable service to the community. The freedom to keep technological innovations from being used for public benefit, or the freedom to profit from public calamities secretly engineered by private advantage. But Polanyi continued, the market economy under which these freedoms throve also produce freedoms we prize highly. Freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, freedom of meeting, freedom of association, freedom to choose one's job. While we may cherish these freedoms for their own sake, and surely many of us still do, they are to a large extent byproducts of the same economy that was also responsible for the evil freedoms. Okay? In any sort of society, a imperfect society that is based on the material realities of our world, there's gonna be this give and take on good and bad freedoms. Okay? I rather have the freedom of education, the freedom of healthcare, the freedom of shelter, right? I'd rather have the freedom away from corporate exploitation. You know, I'd rather have the freedom away from all of those negative freedoms talked about with the free market, right? And when we boil down to the anarchist society that Bakunin and others talk about, a lot of it, in my opinion, is ahistorical, because when you talk about that spontaneous combustion of anarchism, how do you deal with the hegemonic control of capital? How do you counterbalance that? How? If you are alone and hoping that other groups spontaneously come with you, you're going to lose. We saw that with communism to a degree. Like, that's why, like, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. What, am I hearing something right now? Anyways, we saw what happened with siege socialism, where the Bolsheviks thought that we were going to get this international wave of revolutions that was going to topple the capitalist order. What happened? You didn't get that. So the Soviet Union on its own, in a sense, and then China closely after it, on their own against the hegemonic control of capitalism, the hegemonic control of the West. They're invaded by 14 countries. Eventually it was overthrown by capitalism in the 80s and 90s. So it's the idea that like one nation, one small place can revolt against the capitalist order and succeed, whether it's communists or anarchists, is I think wrong and ahistorical. This needs to be an international movement in its totality. Oh, you guys talking in the chat? I didn't know if you were talking to me. By the way, all the giant tech companies that you're talking about in the chat, they're all government subsidized. They couldn't have done it without the collectivization of the society's wealth. That's the reality of it. And as the great Thomas Paine said, I love this quote: personal property is the effect of society. And if it is as impossible, it is as impossible for an individual to acquire personal property without the aid of society as it is for him to make land originally. Separate an individual from society and give him an island or a continent to possess, and he cannot acquire personal property. He cannot be rich. So inseparable are the means connected with the end in all cases, that where the former does not exist, the latter cannot be obtained. All accumulation, therefore, of personal property beyond what a man's own hands produce is derived to him by living in society, and he owes on him every principle of justice, of gratitude, and of civilization, a part of that accumulation back again to society from whence the whole came. If we examine the case minutely, we found that the accumulation of personal property is, in many instances, the effect of paying too little for the labor that produced it, the consequence of which is that the working hand perishes in old age and the employer abounds in affluence. I always go back to that. Heath Farley, the resident anarchist, though, I think I'm slowly turning him into just like an out-and-out communist. Say good points, though, Matt. I don't have answers for a lot of those, at least not off the top of my head. Yeah. And guys, I don't even think we need the argument of do we need better living conditions or toys and gadgets? We can have both. This isn't out of the question, right? I don't it's not how it has to work. Anyways, moving on. And plus, we have so many studies out there that show that countries that have massive social safety nets actually are more productive than ours, or anyone that doesn't have massive social safety nets. Countries that have lower work hours and work days and stuff like that, they're actually more productive. You know why? because they just made the system more efficient to a degree. And you saw that in effect in like USSR. You know, the USSR had 7-hour workdays. They had mandatory leisure time. You shouldn't be working. They had paid like vacation, paid maternity, pre-maternity leave. You know, what happened? They were a far more productive society. They achieved what capitalism did in 30 years. So they achieved in 30 years what capitalism took roughly, let's say, 100 and 150 years. At least. If not more. Like, honestly, like, I think the signs show that when you collectivize society more, it becomes more productive and more beneficial to everyone. Look at Cuba, for example. You know, better literacy rates and better life expectancy rates than us. And they have those crummy apartments, right? But yet they live longer and they can read better than us. Why? You know, like, it's not that hard. Yeah, the Soviets produced crappy cars. Yeah, but they also produced like some of the best films you can ever see. If you haven't seen like Soviet films, you should. I mean, or just take the word of like any U.S. filmmaker like Stanley Kubrick, Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, that all said, no, the Soviet film industry is far more creative than we are. They have far more freedom than we are. I think that was George Lucas's exact words, that they have far more freedom than we do. You know why? Because they don't have fucking profit-hungry fucking producers that are telling them what to do in their movies. You know? Anyways, should we watch this PragerU video? All right, what should we do first, guys? Look, I know we disagree, but that was a funny fucking comment. And I honestly can't disagree with it, because Predator 2 may be the best film in history. That is true. Predator 2 is criminally underrated. Predator 2 is so good. So good. Danny Glover, just in anything, is just fucking golden, let's be honest. That was a good one. That was funny. God damn it. Should we watch the economic update one with Noam Chomsky and Richard Wolff, or should we watch the PragerU video? What should we do? And I also forgot, guys, the 1776 report from Donald Trump and his administration is out, and I thought I should read some of it, because they have like a whole page on challenges to America's principles. One of them on progressivism, one of them on communism, and racism and identity politics. Oh my god, that is so good. So I might read a little bit of this, because, like, why not? It's gotta be fucking hilarious. Though there's a lot in here, so I might come back and do more later on. Yeah, I mean, come on, it's gotta be good, right? Let me know what you guys want to do first. Bill Paxton's a legend as well. Thank you. Yes, Bill Paxton is a fucking legend. Absolutely. Rest in peace. Who was it? There was somebody that was talking to me the other day. Oh, I felt good right there. Neck's killing me. Somebody was talking the other day that was like shitting on Bill Paxton, and I got like mortally offended. I guess if you guys want to tell me, I'll just pick. Let's watch the PragerU video first, because I've been talking for a while. And I want to take a break from talking.
Democratic socialism. It's not the same as socialism, because it's democratic, right? Or something.
Hold on, that was like really, like, it was like buffering for me. Hold on. God damn it, PragerU.
Democratic socialism. It's not the same as socialism. Democratic socialism.
That should be better.
It's not the same as socialism, because it's democratic, right? Or something, right? People are buying that. People buy that now, right? Apparently. As though adding the word democratic in front of a word changes what it means. Just because we toss something to a vote doesn't change what that something is, nor does it alter whether that something is inherently good or bad. Couple of examples, because I know you'll ask. Hamas was democratically elected as the government in Gaza, despite the fact that the destruction of not only Israel, but the eradication of all Jews is in their official charter. Robert Mugabe, or Bobby Mugabe if you prefer, was democratically elected by a loving majority in Zimbabwe. How's that working?
Wait.
Venezuela? Well, Hugo Chavez noted
Wait. Mugabe? You mentioned Mugabe? God, this is so frustrating. It's not like Mugabe. Mugabe's complex. I might have to play another video because of that. God damn. Hugo Chavez, though, the fucking man.
Personal favorite and friend of Sean Penn, to whom he constantly pointed as being unfairly characterized as a dictator when in fact he was democratically elected as a socialist. Well, how'd that work out for Venezuela? Well, it's now on the brink of collapse, despite it being one of the most resource-rich nations in the entire world. Basic things like eggs, milk, flour, and toilet paper are either too expensive for the average Venezuelan or simply out of stock. Out of stock, mind you, democratically. I know. Some of you will say, well, that's not fair because really we knew all along it technically was a dictatorship. Okay, that's fair. Let's move on to example number 2. Denmark? Okay, here's the time where you point to an entirely homogenous population, about 1/60th the size of America's, and you point to that as the blueprint. Okay, let's go there. This is a place where the middle class can't even afford a car because of the 180% new car tax. And the prime minister was so fed up with Americans pointing to it as a beacon for socialist success that he felt compelled to clarify, I would like to make one thing clear. Denmark is far from a socialist planned economy. Denmark is a market economy.
Of course it is.
Sweden? I love Sweden. Okay, great bikini team, and
so you're just mentioning social democratic states that have like a mixed economy now, and saying like, oh, these aren't really socialists because they're not. Ha ha.
thanks to that country, my armoire now doubles as a bookcase. Speaking of which, the founder of IKEA, let's be honest, the only really cool export from Sweden, aside from a few good hockey players, left Sweden because of the stifling high tax rate. So, Sweden, good place, not bad people, but a successful model for a viable economy in today's global market? Incorrect.
Oh my God, my head's gonna explode. I recommend everyone to look into the Social Democratic Party in Sweden and the prime minister at the time in the 70s, I want to say, Olof Palme, who was assassinated. And just look into like them as a social democratic experiment. It's quite interesting what they try to do and how they try to incrementally get to a socialized state. It was very, very intriguing experiment, and how much they're able to uplift the working class and the proletariats up from poverty. It just, again, really impressive. But they also had massive neoliberal free market reforms from the 80s, 90s, and obviously in the 2000s on. So, first off, it's not really a social democratic country anymore. None of the Nordic countries are in a way, because of the neoliberalization that they've gone through. But let's give them the credit that they are. Let's give them some credit for, at least in the 20th century, for what they did, for the social democratic experiment that some of them did. Not Denmark, though, especially not Denmark. However, his example for why that failed was that the CEO of IKEA left the country. That's his only example for why Sweden failed or is failing. is that the CEO of IKEA left the country. That's it. His only example. Also, like, all of these like examples aren't like empirical data. Like I mentioned, like the infant mortality that was dropped in Venezuela from Hugo Chavez's presidency, his administration. You can look that up. You can look up that data. You know, like they're mentioning food was off the shelves. What does that mean? Like, you have anything to? Is that actual statistic, Mark, that we talk about? Like, come on here. Anyways, continue.
The fact is that over time, the greatest enemy of socialism is reality. The reality that human nature will invariably pull certain people toward individualism and success and others toward laziness and collectivism. The tension between the makers and the takers always.
This motherfucker just said that the collectivists are the lazy ones. Does he think union workers are fucking lazy? Oh, that's right. He got beat up by fucking union workers, right? I might have to find that clip now. Fucking idiot.
Always leads to socialism's inevitable collapse. But I know that I can give you examples of failed socialist economies until I'm blue in the face, and you won't care. Because at least socialism is inherently more morally altruistic than the evil, greedy, capitalist warmongering seen in the West. Greed? What's more greedy than wanting to take from someone else something that you haven't earned? Unlike capitalism, free enterprise, which can only occur truly through voluntary transaction, socialism can only occur at gunpoint. That's what it comes down to. If you don't pay your taxes, once you get through the IRS and the auditing and the lawyers and the PR stunts, people make you give the government your money, an increasing amount of your money, the more successful you are, or they send in scary men with guns to take you away. Now, so long as the people having their stuff taken away at gunpoint are in the minority, and the majority feels that they'll get to benefit from more said taken stuff,
What happens if you just choose not to work? Like all the options are bad. Let's say they're all just like not good, right? The free association of trade, all that shit, right? So it just doesn't work. Let's say like they don't want to hire you. What happens? You can't pay rent, can't pay health care. You die. That's not violent. That's not oppressive. That's not holding up at gunpoint, so to speak, right? You know, like that's crazy. God.
You'll always be able to win that decision through a popular vote and claim the moral high ground through democracy. Putting the word democratic in front of your socialism doesn't make it any inherently more moral nor less violent. Did you get that? American wannabe socialists?
What?
Also, get a job. Please, like a real job. You'll probably have to shave first.
I'm
Stephen
YouTube
Crowder
host.
for Prager University.
To subscribe to our YouTube channel,
oh my God. Oh my God. Do people not realize like how many wars in the last, let's say, 200 years were started purely because of companies? Purely because of like trading, like imports and exports. Like that's really it. Or they want to like exploit like a cheap labor base. So let's go and invade this country, perform a coup, put in someone that's more beneficial to us. I mean, I know this came out before this happened, but we had not too long ago a coup that happened in Bolivia at the behest of Elon Musk. So, and why they do that? Because they wanted access to the lithium deposits so they can get a leg up on China. That's why. Okay. That's not corporations pointing guns at people? No? Weird. Weird. It doesn't make sense. Yo, motherfucker in the chat. I allow you to be here because, like, you're funny sometimes. Don't get twisted and start talking shit to me. Okay? Because you make zero relevant points anytime you listen to the show. So sit your ass down and learn. You got it? Thank you. Moving on. Let's talk about, or let's... should we... Let's do the 1776 report. Because I want to do that first, then do the economic update last. We're going to show that way. These are, how did it list it? The risk or concern. What was the phrasing again? The challenges to America's principle. The first one was slavery. I'm not going to read that because I assume they get at least the basics right. Let's get progressivism, though, down. Let's see that. In the decades that followed the Civil War, in response to the Industrial Revolution and the expansion of urban society, many American elites adopted a series of ideas to challenge these changes. Wait. Dude, like we're literally the first sentence, and it's already wrong. American elites did not start progressivism to affect the Industrial Revolution. The American elites were profiting off of the Industrial Revolution, and progressivism was started to counterbalance the economic oppression and exploitation in the Industrial Revolution, and obviously after that in the Gilded Age. Dude, you're a little capitalist fucking Modi supporter, man. Like, fuck off. Like, God, like, why are you so annoying? You know, like, at least the Nazi earlier, like, was annoying and then left. You're like, you stay here and be annoying. It's just, God damn. Weirdos, man. Weirdos in the fucking chat. Although not all at one piece and not without its practical merits, the political thought of progressivism held that the times had moved far beyond the founding era and that contemporary society was too complex any longer to be governed by principles formulated in the 18th century. To use a contemporary analogy, progressives believed that America's original software, the founding documents, were no longer capable of operating America's vastly more complex hardware. Scott in the chat. Thank you, man. I appreciate it. You guys don't back me like Gary backs his, though, man. What the hell, Scott? We're no longer capable of operating America's vastly more complex hardware. The advanced industrial society that emerged since the founding More significantly, the progressives held that truths were not permanent, but only relative to their time. They rejected the self-evident truth of the declaration that all men. What? Okay, all right. They rejected the self-evident truth that all men are created equal and are endowed equally, either by nature or by God, with unchanging rights. As one prominent progressive historian wrote in 1922, to ask whether the natural rights philosophy of the Declaration of Independence is true or false is essentially a meaningless question. Because it was false. They owned fucking slaves. Like, that was the first fucking point you brought up. Oh my God, this is so stupid. So stupid. Instead, progressives believe there were only group rights that are constantly redefined and changed with the times. Indeed, society has the power and obligation not only to define and grant new rights, but also to take old rights away as the country develops. Yeah, that's just like empirically true. Based on this false understanding of rights, progressives design a new system of government. Instead of securing fundamental rights grounded in nature, government operating under a new theory of living constitution should constantly evolve to secure evolving rights. Where the fuck does this like paragraph come from? Right? Am I the only one like that's like confused by this? Like the organization of this shit? Like this paragraph right here. Where does it start? Oh, here we go. My dumbass just keep scrolling. In order to keep with these changes, government would be run more and more by credential managers who would direct society through rules and regulations that mold to the currents of the time. Before he became president of the United States, Woodrow Wilson laid out his new system whereby the function of government, in a very real sense, independent of legislation and even constitutions, meaning that this new view of government would operate independent of the people. Been that way for some time. Far from creating an omniscient body of civil servants led by a pragmatism or science, though, progressives instead created what amounts to a fourth branch of government called at times the bureaucracy or the administrative state. This shadow government, the shadow government never faces elections and today operates largely without checks and balances. The founders were opposed who always opposed government unaccountable to the people and without constitutional restraint, yet it continues to grow around us. Wow. Should I read the fascism part or should like... Oh no, it looks like some bullshit. I should read it, huh? Fascism. The principles of the Declaration have been threatened not only at home. In the 20th century, two global movements threatened to destroy freedom and subject mankind to a new slavery. Though ideological cousins, hold on, so I guess to see it better. There we go. Though ideological cousins, the forces of fascism and communism were bitter enemies in their wars to achieve world domination. What united both totalitarian movements was their utter disdain for natural rights and free peoples. Man. Fascism first arose in Italy under the dictatorship of Benito Mussolini, largely in response to the rise of Bolshevism in Russia. That's actually kind of correct. Like the progressives, Mussolini sought to centralize power under the management of so-called experts. Dude, Mussolini was a paid fucking thug for capital. Like, I forget the company's name. I don't have the book on me. I gave it to my sister to borrow. Though it's been like a month now, and she hasn't given it back. Concerns me. I forget what companies Mussolini basically worked for, and like was busting unions and strikes. That's when Mussolini got his start out. He was working for capital the whole time. Individual rights and freedoms had no purchase under fascism. Its principle is instead, in Mussolini's words, everything in the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. That's like in terms of like patriotism, not in terms of the economy. Eventually, Adolf Hitler in Germany led this militant and dehumanizing political movement to his pseudo-scientific theory of Aryan racial supremacy, and Nazism was born. The Nazi juggernaut quickly conquered much of Europe. The rule of Axis powers, quote, is not a government based upon the consent of the governed, said President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was a social democrat. It is not a union of ordinary self-respecting men and women to protect themselves and their freedom and their dignity from oppression. It is an unholy alliance of power and pelf to dominate and enslave the human race. Before the Nazis could threaten America, in our own hemisphere, the United States built an arsenal of democracy. Great. What? Oh my God. Creating more ships, planes, tanks, and munitions than any other power on Earth. Eventually, America rose up, sending millions of troops across the oceans to preserve freedom. Everywhere American troops went, they embodied in their own ranks and brought with them the principles of the Declaration, liberating people and restoring freedom. Yeah, that's why like all the African American troops that went off abroad and when they're like France and stuff, they saw like how they were treated and they came back to America and started the fucking civil rights movement because they realized how fucked up America is. Anyways, yet while fascism died, what? I think it died. What? Yet, while fascism died in 1945 with the collapse of the Axis powers, it was quickly replaced by a new threat. And the rest of the 20th century was defined by the United States' mortal and moral battle against the forces of communism. Oh, man, this is so good. Oh, it's so sad. People believe this shit. Oh, my God. It pains me. It pains me in my soul, people, that there are ignorant motherfuckers out there that believe this. Communism seems to preach a radical or extreme form of human equality. That is true so far. So far, first sentence, it's right. Bad's core, wrote Karl Marx, is, quote, the idea of the class struggle as the immediate driving force of history, and particularly the class struggle between the bourgeois and the proletariat. It's right so far. Grade A. It's amazing. I mean, this is whoever did this. I don't know, man. I don't know. I've only read 2 sentences so far, but this is pretty accurate. Can you imagine, like, thinking, like, stating, I almost like the first sentence of the Communist Manifesto, basically, that, like, oh, but that's its core that you never heard about. Like, that's the evil core. I know that's not what it said, but that's the implication. Like, but at its core. And it's just, like, again, like, almost the first sentence in the Communist Manifesto, which was, like, the third or fourth thing that Karl Marx wrote, in a long line of things that he wrote, let alone other communists, Marxists, anarchists, socialists, all that stuff. But again, they got it right. That is the idea of class struggle, and who it's between, the bourgeois and the proletariat. In the communist mind, people are not born equal and free. They're defined entirely by their class. Yes, because when you're born, I do not have the same equal material benefit, wealth, status as Jeff Bezos. Right? Like, this isn't like mind-bending stuff here. Like, for any like capitalists out there, mention a third world country. Mention the poorest person there. Okay. When they're born, do they have the same equal status, wealth, access to education, healthcare, the like, as they do? No. Scott Brown, but you could hit the lotto. Oh my God, that is true. You could just hit the lotto and then everything's changed. Oh my God. Under communism, the purpose of government is not to secure rights at all. Okay. Instead, the goal is for a class struggle that necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat. I mean, it is kind of true because, like, in terms of like how we view the proletariat state, I'll call it the transitionary state, as we call it. It is a dictatorship of the proletariat, as Marx wrote, as Lenin echoed, and Engels echoed. And its purpose is to suppress the capital class. That's its purpose. To suppress the capitalist class and to create systems of governance within society that you can then wither away the state. You can strip it away. And then you go from lower communism to higher communism. That's basically what it is. So in terms of like the purpose of the government, yes, that's how we view when we take state power. That's what we want to do, to take that and then abolish capitalism. Yeah, it doesn't seem that insane. By its very nature, this class struggle would be violent. Yeah, that's most likely true, because I mean we're fighting the hegemonic power of capitalism, the military, and the police, which are violent every second that we live. The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims, Marx wrote. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communist revolution. So far, this fucking section's based. Like, everything else has been bullshit in terms of like the other section, but this one so far, based. Just gotta say that. Oh, it's hilarious. This radical rejection of human dignity spread throughout much of the world. I think it's a rejection of human oppression from the ruling bourgeois class. That's what it is. That's what's a rejection of. In Russia, the bloody Bolshevik Revolution, well, all revolutions are bloody. The American Revolution during World War I established the Communist Soviet Union. Communism understands itself as a universalist movement of global conquest. And communist dictatorships eventually seized power through much of Europe and Asia, and significant parts of Africa and South America. Significant parts? Probably in terms of pure landmass, because, I mean, a lot of the Soviet Union was also in Asia, China, and then, North Korea and Vietnam. That's pretty much it for Asia that I can think of. And then, like, Indonesia was, like, a socialist state for, like, a very, very brief amount of time before a CIA coup, and then 1 million people were killed. A fucking genocide happened. Don't worry about it. And in South America, Africa, you had a few. Like Angola, South Africa eventually, Libya. Yeah, okay. Significant parts. I guess so. I was wondering if they're just overstating how much communism was around in the 20th century, but I think they accurately put it. Led by the Soviet Union, communism even threatened or aspired to threaten our liberties here at home. What it could not achieve through force of arms, it attempted through subversion. Oh my God. Did they have the CIA too? Wow. Communism did not succeed in fomenting revolution in America. I wonder what they mean by that. But communism's relentless anti-American, anti-Western, and atheistic propaganda did inspire thousands and perhaps millions to reject and despise the principles of our founding and our government. While America and its allies eventually won the Cold War, this legacy of anti-Americanism is by no means entirely a memory, but still pervades much of academia and the intellectual cultural spheres. The increasingly accepted economic theory of socialism, while less violent than communism, they're the same, is inspired by the same flawed philosophy and leads down the same dangerous path of allowing the state to seize private property and redistribute wealth as the governing elite see fit. Yes. Based. That was a base fucking section right there. Oh, one more section. For generations, Oh my God, they talked about MLK in here. I'm not going to read it all. This is going to be the last part. I have to. For generations, Americans stood as a bulwark against global communism. Our Cold War victory was owing not only to our superior technology, economy, and military. In the end, America won because the Soviet Union was built upon a lie. A lie. As President Ronald Reagan said, quote, "I have seen the rise of fascism and communism, but both theories fail. Both deny those God-given liberties that are inalienable rights of each person on this planet. Indeed, they deny the existence of God." This motherfucker like invaded a sovereign country for a photo op. Like, think about it. This guy invaded Grenada just because he wanted a photo op. Hilarious. Hilarious. Well, there's a lot in there, I guess you guys can read as well, because I am not going to read the rest of that because, wow, that is something. That is crazy. Let's watch one more video. The economic update over at Democracy at Work with Richard Wolff and Noam Chomsky, a Marxist and an anarchist getting together. I like this. I'll be honest. This made me a little bit happy, especially since like Noam Chomsky is like getting old. So is Richard Wolff. Like, I would like to see these people collaborate in some fashion. You know, like I was looking. For those that know me, they know that I'm a big Michael Prentice fan. They know I really echo a lot of what he says about the 20th century, about contextualizing the Soviet Union and sort of realized communism and socialism that we've seen in, again, Soviet Union, China, Vietnam, North Korea, Cuba. Like I value his insight a lot. There's no videos that I can find. There's no lectures where it's him and Chomsky together. And likewise, there's no videos I saw of like Chomsky with Richard Wolff or Chomsky with David Harvey. And I thought that was like rather sad, to be honest, because like the only one I can find of like a real anarchist and Marxist academic getting together and talking in this fashion or any fashion like that is David Graeber and David Harvey. And that's a good video. I might play it one day, but you know, there's a lot of great academics that should be working together. I think it's valuable for us in the movement, especially before they leave this, you know, plane of existence. Absolutely. You know, like Kwame Ture is like, he died at the age of what, 58, 59, something like that. You know, he would have been like 70 something, I think, today. You know, imagine if he was around. You know, we didn't get the content with him and people like Michael Prentice and others because obviously he passed away. These people are living. Let's get them together. It's really important in my opinion. But anyways, I've been waxing poetically too long. Let's move on to Noam Chomsky and Richard Wolff talking on the prospects and task as 2021 begins.
Welcome, friends, to another edition of Economic Update. This one at the beginning of a new year, so let me wish you all a happy and a better new year. The program, as you know, is about economics, about the income, the debts, the jobs we have or don't, for ourselves, for our children, the economics of the world we live in. And I'm your host, Richard Wolff. I want to begin by responding to questions many of you have sent to me to comment about President-elect Joe Biden's economic team, and in particular, the progressives that are said to be on the team and that are said to reflect the openness of Joe Biden to the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. Let me begin with some general comments here. First of all, the economic team contains a remarkable number of carryovers or holdovers, if you like, from the Obama government that Mr. Biden served a few years back. It's as if the Democratic Party wants to suggest that Mr. Trump was a kind of aberration, a weird 4-year interlude, and that now we're going to get back to normal, or we're going to get back to usual, or we're going to get back to business as it was before Mr. Trump. I find this frightening as a probability because it suggests that these folks don't understand that the policies followed before Mr. Trump played a major role in producing Mr. Trump and his electoral victory. Therefore, going back to them strikes me as having not learned the lesson these people claim they have learned. But let me turn to the progressives that are on the team. As best I can tell from my own knowledge, and I do know some of them, there are 3: Heather Boushey, Jared Bernstein, and the new Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen. It seems clear to me that Heather Boushey is the most progressive of those 3 based on the work she has done, particularly around inequality. Jared Bernstein, associated with the Economic Policy Institute, is part of the progressive sort of Washington, D.C. establishment, and he has been a long time. Janet Yellen, I'm a little mystified why she's in that group. I can mention, on grounds of transparency, that she and I were students at Yale University getting our PhDs at about the same time. I had the same curriculum she did. I had the same professors she did. I do know about her training because it was the same as my own. I was involved when I was a graduate student in the efforts to form a new economics association. It was called the Union of Radical Political Economists. A whole group of us were active in starting that association. It is still in business. It produces its own journal. It runs its own section of the American Economics Association. Janet Yellen, as a graduate student and since, has had absolutely nothing to do with any of that, because I would know, since I have been involved with that all of my adult life. It was revealed a few days ago that since her time
as an academic
as head of the Federal Reserve a few years ago, she has been giving speeches. She has earned apparently in the neighborhood of $7 to $8 million giving those speeches, and they include apparently a big fat fees from the Goldman Sachs company.
Of course.
Something that got Hillary Clinton into some difficulty, you may recall, a few years ago. Not usually part of the credentials of progressives, for all the reasons you don't need me to remind you about. So these 3 progressives are what you have. What they will do on the Council of Economic Advisors or as the Secretary of the Treasury is an open question. Are they sensitive to issues of inequality? Absolutely, they say so, and I take them at their word. But these are also people who have never gone outside the consensus of Washington, D.C. And what does that mean? It means they do not question capitalism, ever. They do not raise the issue that maybe some of the problems of inequality have to do with the way capitalist enterprises are organized. You know, with a tiny group of people at the top, the major shareholders, the board of directors, the CEO, making all the key decisions and resulting in, what a big surprise, giving the bulk of the money to themselves in dividends, in huge salaries for the top executives. Isn't that a part of the problem? Well, you won't hear that from them. at least you never have before. Could they change? Absolutely. Could they become open to it? For sure. After all, Roosevelt became open, and he was a middle-of-the-road fellow,
He became open
just
through
like them
massive labor
back in the
movements
30s.
pushing him that
But
way.
there was this difference. In the 1930s, a massive movement from below, the CIO, the biggest unionization drive in American history, two socialist parties and a communist party, all working together.
Strong socialist and
That's
communist
what
parties
made
too.
the New
Strong
Deal.
parties.
That's what made a politician middle of the road like Franklin Roosevelt become a champion of real progressivism. It could happen again, but that will have to depend on whether a movement from below develops. It will not depend on these folks in the Biden economic team. My next update is a kind of respect I want to pay to an enormously important development in Argentina in recent weeks.
But this is
The
cool too.
Argentine Senate, under enormous pressure from a massive movement of the Argentinian people, led by the women of Argentina, who have been fighting this fight for a good 6 or 7 years and probably longer, but 6 or 7 years in the public eye. The women assembled a powerful coalition, including many labor unions and many radical social movements. They put them all together. And what did they achieve? They defeated the government on a central issue: the right to an abortion if a woman wishes to choose that way of dealing with her own body. The government opposed them. The Roman Catholic Church, the dominant religious institution in that country, opposed them. They defeated the government and they defeated the church, which went to extraordinary lengths, partly because the current pope comes from Argentina, as some of you may know. And the church went all out and it lost. And what's the significance? A mass mobilization from below, the very kind of mobilization I mentioned a few moments ago as making it possible that there might be a progressive Biden administration, because otherwise there won't be, and there isn't one now. That kind of a movement that I talked about hypothetically in the United States is already a reality in Argentina. They got the Senate, to the surprise of many, to vote in favor. All women in Argentina will now be able legally to acquire an abortion up until the 14th week of a pregnancy. Before this action in Argentina, one of the largest and most important economies in all of Latin America, only very small parts of Latin America had legalized abortion. Cuba, of course, Uruguay,
Of course.
Guyana, and some parts of Mexico. That's it. All the main parts of Latin America were steadfastly in the control of governments and the Roman Catholic Church on the question of abortion. Already there are signs that in both Chile and Brazil, large Latin American countries like Argentina, the women's movements there have taken an enormous inspiration to take the same steps in their country. Things are changing south of the border, and they will not be limited to questions of abortion. They will go far beyond that to the rest of the social issues burning in that part of the world. My next update for today has to do with another question many of you have written to us about. This is the disconnect that now exists between what is going on in the stock market, the place where the richest of our rich people hold their wealth, and the economic realities facing the rest of us. It is as stark a difference as many of you know simply from looking around the communities where you live, where you work, and where you shop. An analyst at Nomura Securities in New York recently put his finger on it. He says the stock market in New York City is, quote, foaming at the mouth. Well, another way of saying that is, it's crazy. But in its craziness, it reflects a truth. And that truth is the growing distance between the 1 to 5% of people rich enough to care about what's going on in the stock market. And that's all it is. The majority of people have no stocks. The minority who have them don't have enough to make much of a difference in their life. The 11 shares you inherited when grandma passed is not making you a player in the stock market. The core of people, very small, who control the bulk of the shares, 10% of shareholders own 80% of the shares, they're the ones doing real well. And let's give credit where credit is due. The government of this country, which is in service of this 1 to 5% at the top, the government has decided to deal with the depression economically we're in, with the COVID-19 collapse on top of it, by pumping money into the economy to beat the band. The Federal Reserve has pumped in many trillions of dollars. The Treasury has been spending money it doesn't have by borrowing, and that ultimately comes from the Federal Reserve as well. So we have all this money being created. Because the mass of people are poor in America now and can't borrow, that money doesn't go in to produce more goods and services and hire people to produce them, because the people of America can't buy this stuff. Millions are unemployed and everybody else is scared to death. So where does the money go if it doesn't go into producing goods and services, since the demand isn't there? It goes into the stock market, where it bids up the price of stocks, which is what the rich people are happy about, because it makes them richer still. That's why the billionaires in America amassed another $2 trillion while the rest of us were struggling with the COVID-19 disaster. It is a society ripped apart by its inequality. That's a story that never ends well, when a society makes the rich richer while impoverishing the mass of people. We're on that road, and Mr. Biden better get us off, or else we will have another Trump before long. Look, the crises of this society are multiplying. It's a period of decline unless mass action turns it around. We've come to the end of the first part of today's show. Before we move on, I want to remind you about our new book, The Sickness is the System: When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. Go to democracyatwork.info/books to learn more or to get your copy. I want also to thank our Patreon community for their invaluable support. And if you haven't already, go to
I love how he says Patreon.
Patreon.com/economic update to learn more about
like how your grandpa
you
says,
can
like
get
Facebook
involved.
and share Twitter.
And now it is my
So
pleasure
cute.
to
It's
urge you
adorable.
not only to stay with us, because we'll be right back, but to let you know that our guest today, who really needs no introduction, is Noam Chomsky, talking about where we are and where we're going. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Oh, we're not going anywhere, Richard.
Welcome back, friends, to the second half of today's economic update. I am really and genuinely honored and pleased to be able to welcome to our microphones and our cameras Professor Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky is Institute Professor Emeritus in the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. He is also the Laureate Professor of Linguistics in the program in Environment and Social Justice at the University of Arizona. His work is widely credited with having revolutionized the field of modern linguistics. He is also the author of numerous best-selling political works, which have been translated into literally scores of languages around the world. He has a new book released in January of 2021 called The Consequences of Capitalism. Thank you very much, Noam Chomsky, for joining us.
Glad to be with you.
Good. Let me start off by the question I know many of our viewers and listeners have. What difference do you think the new Biden administration will make in the basics of American domestic and foreign policy? With a particular addition, do you think that the Trump years now ended will be seen as a kind of temporary aberration, an interruption, or is it more logically a part of an evolving American position in the world?
I don't, as far as Biden is concerned, I think the answer to the question will depend on the level of popular activism that works to press him towards a somewhat more progressive social democratic stand. If there isn't that pressure, he'll revert to the Clintonite, DNC, Wall Street-oriented neoliberal programs of the past 40 years.
That's right.
But with pressure, he could change, and it's critical on, especially on truly existential issues, like global warming, for example. That we can't delay on doing something about that, or everything else is essentially moot. He could be pressed, but he'll have to be pressed. It won't happen by itself. As far as Trump is concerned, I don't think he's going away. He won't be sitting in the White House, but he'll be basically, I presume, trying to run kind of an alternative government in combination with Mitch McConnell, the real evil genius of the Trump administration, whose goal very likely will be to try to make the country ungovernable, the way McConnell openly and proudly tried to do with Obama, make sure that the serious problems can't be dealt with properly. There'll be chaos they can blame it on the government, probably try to roar back into power. Trump himself has the voting base of the Republican Party in his pocket. Large majority of Republican voters say he's their savior, he's the future of the Republican Party. I don't think this is going to disappear. It has deep roots, many deep roots. It's not unique to the United States. The similar kinds of anger, resentment, contempt for institutions are taking place in every country where the neoliberal assault of the past 40 years has operated, severely damaging the general population, causing enormous inequality, undermining democracy, leaving people angry and frustrated. It's taken many forms. In the United States, it's combined with underlying. Trump was a genius at tapping the poisonous undercurrents of American society and culture, like white supremacy, crucially. He was able to bring them to the surface. They're not going away either. It's the form in which the resentment and anger, which are quite justified about what's happened for the past 40 years, form in which it's being expressed. And we shouldn't overlook, well, okay. I was just going to say we shouldn't overlook how serious this is. You've probably talked on the program about the Rand Corporation study that came out a couple of weeks ago, where they tried to estimate the transfer of wealth from the working class and the middle class, in their terms, the lower 90% of income level, transfer of wealth from them to the very top of the wealth ladder. That means the top fraction of 1%. But their estimate is about $47 trillion, not small change. And that's a serious underestimate. Doesn't take into account everything that happened after Reagan opened the spigot. tax havens, destruction of unions, and so on.
Let me continue this line with you for a moment, if I could. This kind of extreme inequality, which has been building, as you say, for 40 years or longer, and is now almost accelerating, even though it has been going on for so long. That's a kind of story in human history that doesn't end real well. Do you think that the growing anger, bitterness, rage, envy, whatever you want to call it, will continue to be useful to the right wing more than it has been to the
Good
left
question.
in developing?
Well, I'm old enough to remember an earlier case of this, the early 1930s, my childhood, when there were something similar was happening. The system had broken down, very severe depression, much worse than now. And there were essentially two ways out. One way out was fascism, which we should remember reached its hideous peak in the most advanced country in the world, the country which was the peak of Western civilization in the sciences, the arts, regarded as a model of democracy. It's Germany. That became the depths of human history within a few years. The other possible way out was social.
And I want to add, like, also Germany was one of the strongest sort of socialist states, if you, or should say that, I'd say one of the strongest countries, is one of the few countries that had such a vast socialist movement within it before World War I and even after that, to a degree. It was obliterated in 1919-ish, give or take. And after that, you have this rapid rise of fascism and it take over, you know. Something just to be wary of, right? Even in a country like Noam Chomsky said, that was the most advanced in a lot of ways, and also in a lot of ways the most socialist in terms of how powerful socialist movements were, how powerful the Social Democratic Party was in Germany, how powerful the Communist Party was in Germany. It blew away anything that Eugene Debs had. Okay, that's just the reality.
The way out was social democracy, which happened in the United States under the New Deal, under tremendous popular activism and pressure. CIO organizing, militant labor actions, political activity swung the balance. And it's a very delicate balance. So as far as your question is concerned, we're not in 1929, but there are some similarities and could go either way.
Any chance of in your view, of the Democratic and or Republican parties being the place where any of this kind of left-wing alternative emerges? And I'm not asking you to predict, or does it need an independent, a third, a different kind of political party or formation to get it done? How do you see that question that is on so many people's minds now?
Well, as you know, of course, to form a viable third party under the highly regressive US political system is extremely difficult. It's not out of the question. Should be attempted. Tony Mazzacchi's efforts at a labor party, great labor organizer and environmentalist, Tony Mazzacchi, back in the 90s, might have gotten somewhere, could be revived now. It's going to require a revival of the labor movement. That's going to be crucial for it. The other possibility is to try to move the Democratic Party a little towards the social democratic side. What's called the left here is a strange notion. So Bernie Sanders is called a radical. His views are too extreme to be tolerated in the United States. And what are his main views? Universal health care. Can you think of a country in the world that doesn't have it?
Right.
Mexico,
Canada,
Europe, everybody has it. Free higher education, Mexico, Germany, Finland, almost everywhere. Those are considered too radical for Americans. One of the chief correspondents of the London Financial Times, Rana Farahar, associate editor, very good journalist, commented sort of semi-jokingly that if Bernie Sanders was in Germany, he could be running on the Christian Democrat ticket, the right-wing party. That's what's called way too far to the left in the United States. So yes, a move towards moderate social democracy, return to something of the New Deal style would be a major step forward, but it's not left. It's a step towards moderate sanity. And that can be achieved, I think.
In the interest of the waning minutes that we have, I wanted to ask you a question about political strategy, theory, philosophy, since I know you have been concerned with that most of your life. The relationship between Marxism and anarchism as impulses, as movements,
I'm so excited you got to this question.
as traditions,
I think we're going to get to it.
have been on again, off again, allies, enemies, and everything in between. Do you see either of those traditions, or both of them, as playing an important role now and in the future in the situations you've just described?
The traditions, yes, but the words, probably not. The United States is a very unusual country. We can't ignore the fact. It's a shame, should be overcome, but it's a fact. I don't know of any other country, except extreme right-wing dictatorships, where a person can't identify himself as a socialist. The term socialism in other countries is kind of like saying I'm a Democrat here. If you're a communist, you can run for a political office. Maybe people won't like it, but in the United States, these are terms of opprobrium. We have such a well-functioning propaganda system that ideas that are normal in comparable countries are considered utterly beyond the pale here. So terminology is, you have to be careful with it. But the idea is, yes, I think most of the population, judging by attitude studies, pretty much supports these attitudes and views. You maybe have to approach them with different terminology, but yes, you can. Take the common thread of left Marxist and anarchist thinking. Working people should control the work environment and the enterprises in which they work. That's an old American view, so common that it was the slogan of the Republican Party under Abraham Lincoln, was the main driving force for the most effective radical movements in American history. Knights of Labor, the populist movement of the late 19th century. I don't think that's very far below the surface. And I think that can be recovered. And that is the lead driving element in the left Marxist anarchist tradition.
Noam Chomsky, I wish we had much more time. I am very grateful for the time you have given, and I know I speak for my audience, both the listeners and the viewers. Yours is a lifetime of commitment to something that a whole new generation is learning they want to commit to. And I want, on their behalf and for myself, to thank you for all that you have done, including being with us today.
That was awesome. That warmed my heart, honestly. That was great. You guys, I know I put in the title the Jimmy Dore thing, and I want to get into it, but I'm so hungry and I'm tired. This is my second show today, so I'll come back on Wednesday, Thursday, maybe Friday. I don't know. I'll come back later this week and talk about Jimmy Dore and other shit, and I'll find other topics to talk about as well. Everyone, thank you for tuning in to this show. Always love the interaction in the chat. And, oh, what is playing? I knew this one was playing. Ah, that's it. There we go. I found it. Anyways, guys, thank you for listening. If you want to support the show, patreon.com/Trending Now Network, Cash App, Trending Now Network. Or, of course, just hit the like button, share the show, subscribe, all the other free ways to support the show. We support as well. What else? Nick's Combat Radio is coming back on Wednesday. And yeah, depending on how busy that day is, I will either do another General Strike podcast show that day or the next day after it. But guys, have a great day, great evening, great night. Have a good Martin Luther King Day. Go learn about him. It's not like he wrote a ton of literature, so it's not like it takes you a long time. Go read Letter from Birmingham Jail. I highly recommend that one. It's a quick read, too. It's super fast. And you get basically the big gist of his political ideology as well. Have a great day, great evening, great night. And remember, at all times, fuck the police and free Palestine. Peace.